Demonstrators gather again in Minneapolis as state troops prepare to impose a weekend curfew after 4 nights of rioting over the death of George Floyd. These are live pictures from Los Angeles, where groups have confronted law enforcement officers as nationwide protests are held over police brutality. Protesters are gathering again in cities across the United States as anger over the killing of African-American George Floyd under the knee of a white police officer shows no signs of abating. Minnesota, Georgia, Ohio, Colorado, Denver, Kentucky and the District of Columbia have all now either activated or requested the National Guard to assist local law enforcement to try to stem the violence which has accompanied many of the protests. Well, these are the live pictures from Los Angeles, where here again the city is into a 4th day of protests as people, multiracial crowds in fact, turn out to protest police brutality sparked by the death of George Floyd. It's become a nationwide uprising. Friday night into Saturday morning, protests in downtown LA turned violent, making the city among many across the nation struggling to stem the unrest and the anger. At the moment, it looks fairly quiet. Protesters detained and contained, not detained, should I say, contained by armed officers. Well, President Trump has been speaking about the death of George Floyd and said that it should never have happened.
The death of George Floyd on the streets of Minneapolis was a grave tragedy. It should never have happened. It has filled Americans all over the country with horror, anger, and grief. Yesterday, I spoke to George's family and express the sorrow of our entire nation for their loss. I stand before you as a friend and ally to every American seeking justice and peace, and I stand before you in firm opposition to anyone exploiting this tragedy to loot, rob, attack, and menace.
Our correspondent Barbara Plett-Usher is in Minneapolis. Her report contains some distressing images.
America is rising up in anger over the killing of another black man in police custody. In Minneapolis, protesters defied a curfew, taking over the streets for the 4th night in a row, turning them into a smoky battleground. Security forces were overwhelmed. The governor has now announced the largest mobilization of the National Guard in the state's history. He blames outsiders for spearheading the violence.
The situation in Minneapolis is no longer in any way about the murder of George Floyd. It is about attacking civil society, instilling fear, and disrupting our great cities.
The scale of destruction is bigger than in previous protests over race-related deaths.
Here in Minneapolis, this is the damage after another night of chaos. Authorities thought that they had calmed things down after they moved swiftly to charge a police officer for the death of George Floyd. And they were shocked when the violence escalated instead.
I cannot breathe.
A widely publicized video shows the officer kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck as he begs for air. In footage that emerged today, you can see 2 other policemen were also holding him down, ignoring his pleas to be allowed to stand up. The graphic images have ignited protests across a country already grappling with the deadly pandemic and suffering its worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. In Seattle, Washington, demonstrators hurled a rock at an Amazon store. They chanted, "I can't breathe," and "Black Lives Matter." In Charlotte, North Carolina, police fired tear gas. A city council member was among several people arrested. And in Atlanta, Georgia, protesters threw rocks and smoke grenades at police, trashed cars, and smashed windows at CNN headquarters. The governor issued a state of emergency, and the mayor pleaded for the riots to stop.
You are disgracing our city. You are disgracing the life of George Floyd and every other person who has been killed in this country. We are better than this. We're better than this as a city. We are better than this as a country.
Well, I'm duty bound to be here to simply say that it is your duty not to burn your own house down for anger with an enemy.
Accountability is what protesters are demanding. But in Minneapolis, hundreds, maybe thousands of people came out to show that they don't want to burn the house down to get it. They cleared away the wreckage left behind by nights of rage, aware that another one may be coming. Barbara Platt-Usher, BBC News, Minneapolis.
Professor Kay Whitehead is an educator, author and media host who's known as the Black Mummy activist. She teaches African and African American studies at Loyola University in Baltimore, Maryland, from where she told us that the violence had a clear context.
I think it's important to recognize that the murder of George Floyd comes on top of so much injustice and so many unarmed Black men, women, and children who have been killed ever since we've been protesting Black Lives Matter. I know we can go back and look at the modern civil rights movement in terms of the history of how we got here, but if we just focus on Black Lives Matter, I could easily go through a litany of names of Black men, women, and children, from Trayvon Martin to Tamir Rice to Mike Brown to Eric Gardner. And then most recently, we had Breonna Taylor, a Black woman who was shot and killed in her own home in Louisville, Kentucky. Ahmaud Arbery, a Black man that was shot and killed in Georgia while he was out jogging. And now we have George Floyd. The latest incident is so disturbing because you can watch it in real time and you can hear him struggling, yelling out that he couldn't breathe, calling for his mother. It is the injustice that we are dealing with as Black and brown people in this country when we see this happening to people that could be part of our families, and then we don't see people being held accountable. So there's a lot of pent-up frustration that got us to this moment.
You can change policy, but that doesn't necessarily change attitudes, not least within the police. So how do you bring about meaningful change?
What is interesting is that we've been wrestling with this question around change for quite a while. What would it look like if we were to do something different? So when we talk about police officers, that's kind of a point one, that to do an intensive training with police officers so that we can build the bridge between the police force and the community. There's predatory policing that has happened in economically challenged Black communities where they are over-policed, where they are herded and controlled rather than protected and served. So that needs to happen. We need to have more accountability with police officers. So when they do what these police officers participated in, it's not just that they are arrested, it's not just that they are fired, it's not just that they are charged, but they are found guilty and they serve time so that people understand there is a price to pay, there's accountability. A second thing is to think about reparations. Right now we're looking at how we are economically challenged in this community. We see how the median income of Black people is steadily dropping. By the year 2053, they are estimating that the median income for a Black family will be zero in comparison to our white counterparts. So a way of redistributing funds will hopefully turn around decades upon decades of economic injustice in our community. And third, which I think is the hardest piece, is how do we change the hearts and minds of people? There is a large community of people, not of color, in this country, of white people who really believe that Black folks are inferior. They're part of groups of white nationalism and white supremacy, and they are pushing that age-old agenda that race is a determining factor. We're fighting against the hearts and minds of those individuals as well.
Professor Kay Whitehead from Loyola University in Maryland. Let's just take you briefly back to Los Angeles, where you can see it's about just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon local time. People have come back out onto the streets again, not in the numbers that we've seen at times, particularly in other cities, but some of the roads partially blocked. Last night, the police in Los Angeles have tried to shut down much of downtown. Those restrictions obviously now lifted, but an appeal for calm and peaceful protest.
Tensions in Minneapolis as protesters and police clash as curfew orders are ignored. Police and National Guard troops fire tear gas and flares are thrown back. The governor urges people to stay at home.
And it's very clear on this. This is a very simple order. There's a curfew issued by the mayors and backed by the state that you shouldn't be on the streets tonight. And I will leave it at that. When you decide to make the decision to go outside tonight, the assumption is you're out there to join in the wanton destruction.
Waves of protests taking place across the cities of the States. This is Los Angeles Fire Department. They're putting out a fire. Fires have been burning, not just in Los Angeles, but in other cities too. In LA, there were peaceful protests earlier in the day. Roads were blocked as people came out onto the streets, and then police cars were destroyed, about a dozen of them in one street, one of them set on fire, and it seems other fires have been burning too. A curfew is in place officially in Los Angeles and around a dozen other cities right across the United States. It may be keeping some people at home, but not all. Thousands are still in the streets, still protesting and still angry.